Good day. The last couple of hours there's been less information from the Ukrainian battlefront fields, possibly because the heavy snow is making movement more difficult. There are some suggestions, and I want to stress these are purely suggestions, I don't know whether that is true, that the snow is having more of an effect complicating Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut as opposed to the Wagner organization's advance in that town. But I want to stress that's just a report, one stray report I saw. I'm a little surprised about it. I would have thought, on the contrary, that it's attackers who are more likely to be affected by heavy snowdrifts, and including snow within an urban setting. But anyway, for what it's worth, I pass it on. I also saw another report which claimed that General Syrskyi, the commander of Ukrainian ground troops, has now come and informed President Zelensky that the center of Bakhmut has essentially fallen to the Russians and that the road from Konstantinovka has been cut. I put very low reliance upon this particular report. It seems to me that if the center of Bakhmut had indeed been captured by the Russians in its entirety, we would have had some more concrete reports about that. And since the administrative building lies within the center of Bakhmut, we would presumably have seen photographs of it flying the Russian flag. The one part of this report that might have some weight is the one about the road from Konstantinovka having been cut. To be very clear, I don't think that is the case, but I did see reports yesterday, which I think are rather more reliable, that the Russians have, over the last couple of hours, begun a major assault on the village of Ivanivska near Bakhmut, and that they've been, in the previous days, engaging in very heavy shelling of Ukrainian positions in that particular village. Now, if the Russians do capture Ivanivska, that will undoubtedly cut the southern spur of the road from Konstantinovka. It will not fully cut the northern spur, which passes through a different village, which is, of course, Homovo. However, for some time, the Russians have been encamped very close to both spurs of this road, the southern spur that passes through Ivanivska and the northern spur which passes through Homovo, and it's been accepted for some time also that the heavy snowfalls, that the roads are unusable by heavy traffic, by heavy Ukrainian traffic, by convoys of lorries and such things, because they can now be easily shelled or targeted by Russian artillery, including mortars and anti-tank missiles. I would add that the heavy snowfalls, I would have thought, will have further complicated problems of resupply of the Ukrainian troops within Bakhmut itself. It will have made use of the fields and the country roads even harder than it has been up to now, and that may continue for some time. And of course, when the snow starts to melt, that will probably cause the mud to get worse again, which might complicate Ukrainian resupply in Bakhmut even further. If it is indeed the case that the Russians are able to progress faster, despite the snow in Bakhmut, than the Ukrainians are able to defend, then I'm going to make a guess it's probably related to supply issues, that the Ukrainians are running short of supplies and can't get more supplies across the fields and the dirt roads, and that's complicating their position, their defences within Bakhmut itself even, even more. Now, there's been a long report about the fighting in Bakhmut and in areas round about in The Guardian. It's by a journalist who hasn't obviously got anywhere close to Bakhmut itself, and I don't think it provides much enlightenment about the actual fighting in Bakhmut itself. It's very impressionistic, and the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers that the Guardian journalist has spoken to, are clearly heavily briefed by the Ukrainian military to follow the official line. But there are some things that this article does say which I think are of some interest. Firstly, it reports the fact that there's been criticism of President Zelensky's decision to fight on in Bakhmut, and that this criticism is coming from within Ukraine itself. And it says, this is quoting directly from this article, as the Russian attacks continue, there is concern in some circles that President Zelensky's stubborn insistence on fighting in the city could blunt the offensive potential of Ukraine's army. Ludmila Buymeister, an MP who was formerly part of Zelensky's party in the parliament, and since the start of the war a special forces commander, called for a tactical retreat in mid-March to preserve Ukrainian lives, and argued a lost battle does not mean a lost war. And there's also some further reports, and this is the same article, about what might happen after Bakhmut is finally captured by the Russians. And we have this report, this is in the Guardian article. Alexander, a spokesman for the 24th Brigade, adds that while Bakhmut may be surrounded on three sides, its tall and well-built central buildings, many of which also have extensive basements, make it easier to defend than Chasov Yar, the next village on 8 miles west. It is mostly small houses there, he says, and the village is being heavily bombed. The sound of incoming artillery was clearly audible on Thursday from neighbouring Konstantinovka, a further 7 miles to the southwest. So shelling continues very heavy. Russian shelling continues very heavy in all of these areas. Chasov Yar is being shelled. Ivanivska is being shelled. Bakhmut is also being shelled by the Russians. And a Ukrainian spokesman of a military unit in the area has come forward and said that if Bakhmut falls, it's going to be much more difficult to defend Chasov Yar, the next village to the west. And that argues against the many claims I've been hearing in the past that Bakhmut itself, its capture, is really of little strategic significance because it's going to be easier. There's all sorts easier to hold the positions for Ukraine to the west of Bakhmut because there are stronger defense lines to the west of Bakhmut than Bakhmut itself. On the contrary, this report suggests that Bakhmut is much easier to defend than some of these places further west, Chasov Yar specifically, because of the urban landscape. The large apartment buildings, the domi, the big Soviet-era apartment buildings built to exceptionally high specifications. I've seen them. I've actually stayed in them from time to time. These are extraordinarily large, strong buildings, easy to defend. And as Alexander, the spokesman for the 24th Brigade, says, many of them have basements, extensive basements, and they are natural fortresses Now, the Russians claim that they're capturing these at the rate of 3 to 8 a day. I've no reason to doubt that. Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner organization, said the same thing. Again, I've no particular reason to doubt that. But they do provide Ukraine with a solid basis upon which they can defend Bakhmut. The same, by the way, is true in Vuhledar. Now, we also have further reports about the fighting, the mood further west from Bakhmut. Residents from the east side of Konstantinivka, nearest the front line, have already made up their own mind, knowing that despite the determined resistance, Bakhmut may fall at any time. The district on the far side of the railway is largely deserted, says Mykola Tereshchenko, an assistant mayor in the town, who adds that around 40 to 50 people a day are asking to be evacuated further west. And then we go on to read, Russian bombs are striking with increasing frequency in the exposed eastern district of Konstantinovka. 3 women were killed and several wounded when a so-called invincibility shelter for people fleeing the fighting was struck around midnight on 24th March. One of the wounded, Igor Andreev, 52, his face covered in bruises, is still being treated in the town's hospital. Confidence is draining from Konstantinovka, and many of its shops and buildings are boarded up, even those that are still functioning. And so it looks as if people in the area close to Bakhmut are making up their own minds. They expect Bakhmut will fall soon, and we see that the Russians are able to shell Konstantinovka as well as Chasov Yar, and the people in Konstantinovka are sensing that the battle is soon going to reach them. Even as the fighting in Bakhmut continues, and by the way, there was another report, this is from a Russian source, which predicted that with the Wagner organization gaining ground in Bakhmut, in the center of Bakhmut, there would be a significant breakthrough in Bakhmut by the Wagner forces over the course of next week. Well, we'll see. Anyway, even as the fighting in Bakhmut continues, there are contradictory reports from Avdiivka. One report from a Ukrainian source suggested that the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back a short distance near a place called Voidanoye. Another report, completely different report, said on the contrary, this is another Ukrainian report, I should say, said on the contrary, that Russian forces around Avdiivka are increasing in size and power, especially to the north of Avdiivka, and this report suggests a serious crisis for Ukraine there. I also saw another report earlier, I think this was from a Russian source, that claimed that Russian forces from a village called Opitnoye to the south of Bakhmut, to the south of Avdiivka, are pushing northward towards Avdiivka, which would appear to contradict that first Ukrainian report that I spoke about. Let me reiterate again, I am not on location in any of these places. Inevitably, there's a lot of fog of war. The one thing that everybody agrees about is that Avdiivka has been pretty much destroyed as a town. Most of the buildings have now been shelled or blasted by Russian artillery and Russian bombing. And as I said, the city itself, the town, is essentially a ghost town. And for what it's worth, even if the Ukrainians are making occasional gains in the fighting around Avdiivka, even if they are able to push the Russians back in one place or another for a day or so, the direction of the fighting is clear and the Russians are still very much holding the initiative there. So that's Avdiivka at the moment. And going back to that Guardian report, it had a fair amount to say about the Ukrainian counteroffensive that we've been hearing quite a lot about. It mentioned the fact that the Ukrainians are complaining, Ukrainian soldiers are complaining that they haven't seen any of the Western equipment that they've been promised, that they're still operating their old T-64 tanks, some of which go back to the 1960s. I have to stress again that this is a bit of a red herring issue. The largest number of Western tanks that Ukraine is going to get, the single biggest block of Western tanks that are heading towards Ukraine, are not Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, and M1 Abrams tanks. They are Leopard 1s, German Leopard 1 tanks, mainly built in the 1960s with relatively thin armour and a 105mm rifled gun. They are not more advanced than the T-64s. The Ukrainians have been operating since before the war began. They are less advanced, in some respects at least, than those T-64s that the Ukrainians still have. Anyway, this Guardian report said that Ukraine has a total of around 900 tanks, which I suspect is probably true if we combine the 500 T-64s that Ukraine probably, or by some reports still has, with the various deliveries of tanks in the West that it has been receiving since mid-summer of last year. Most of which, by the way, as was correctly pointed out by Brian Beletic, continue to be Soviet-era T-72s or relatively new build, modified T-72s built in Poland. So, just saying. But anyway, 900 Ukrainian tanks against, at the very least, 1,800 Russian tanks, but with some Ukrainian soldiers confirming what Putin said the other day, that the Russians have at least a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers of tanks deployed on the battlefields. And I am confident that this is a 3-to-1 advantage, which does not include the T-62s and possibly T-55s, which have been so much talked about and which the Russians themselves have said are not being operated directly on the battlefields as tanks. Anyway, there we go. So, complaints from some of the Ukrainian soldiers that they're not getting the equipment they need to the Western equipment that they've been promised, and comments about Western weapons deliveries from the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius. And this is taken now from the Daily Telegraph. Germany's defense minister has ruled out sending any further weapons or equipment to Ukraine, admitting that the Bundeswehr will already not be able to replenish its stocks by 2030. Blighted by chronic underinvestment since the end of the Cold War, something which, by the way, is true of all Western militaries, including Britain's specifically, which appears to be in almost as bad a shape as Germany's, but also including, to a certain extent, the United States military as well. Anyway, blighted by chronic underinvestment since the end of the Cold War, the German army is now in even worse shape after having sent equipment, ammunition and vehicles like the Leopard 2 main battle tank to the battlefields of Ukraine. To put it bluntly, like other nations, we have a limited inventory, said Boris Pistorius. As Federal Defence Minister, I cannot give everything away, he told German broadcaster Welt. Given gaps in the military will be impossible to bridge by 2030. The German government wants to grow the Bundeswehr to a 200,000 strong force and spend $130 billion, euros rather, on new equipment by the end of the decade. We all know that the existing gaps cannot be closed by 2030. It will take years. Everyone is aware of that. And there's more about this because, as well as giving this interview to German television, Mr. Pistorius has also been talking to others. This is a rather fuller report about his interview with Welt on Sonntag. And he said that the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance plan to send 2 battalions of Leopard 2 tanks and 4 battalions of Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine, while no more announced deliveries are planned. I don't see a scenario in which it would be possible to send Ukraine additional Leopards beyond what was announced. So there we are. Around 88 Leopard 2s, if all these commitments are to supply Leopard 2s are fully realised, which, by the way, may not be true. It may be less than that. I've seen some suggestions. It's more plausibly going to be around 60 Leopard 2s and a larger number of Leopard 1s, perhaps 180 taken out of store. But as I've said already, these Leopard 1s are old tanks, designed in the 1950s, used by the Bundeswehr and other European armies in the 1960s and 1970s, with thin armour and 105mm rifled guns, not in any way comparable to the much more powerful 125mm smoothbore guns with which Russian tanks are equipped. And of course, Russian tanks have much more powerful and stronger armour than those of the Leopard 1s. Now, I am going to say, and I can just repeat again, that of course there's also other tanks from other locations. There's the 14 Challenger 2s from Britain, and I think the total number of tanks from Britain is probably going to stay at 14. These these Challenger 2s are more modern tanks. They date from the 1980s. There's only 14 of them, and of course they use rifled guns, different from the smoothbore guns of the Leopard 2s, complicating logistics, and by all accounts, they're rather complicated. Well, by most accounts, they're rather complicated tanks to operate anyway. But regardless of that, there's only going to be 14 of them, apparently just enough to form a single company. And I wonder exactly how the Ukrainians are expected to deploy them. And then sometime in the autumn, Ukraine is likely to receive 31 M1 Abrams tanks from the United States. These are also going to be relatively, first generation Abrams tanks. I assume they're going to have the 120mm smoothbore gun as opposed to the 105mm rifled gun that they started with. But, even that I'm not absolutely sure about. Anyway, we shall see. And, of course, they're going to come in the autumn. They're probably, they're less advanced, or at least they're less modern than the T-90M tanks that the Russians are now deploying in quantity on the battlefronts, which are modern, up-to-date tanks in current production. And lastly, we have the AMX 10 RC French so-called wheeled tanks, which have extremely thin armour, are not tracked, have a less powerful gun, 105mm gun, even than the Leopard 1, rifled gun as well, by the way, and which gun, however, lacks stabilization, which means that these fragile, thinly armed, wheeled vehicles have to stop before they can fire their gun. They can't fire their gun on the move. So, not perhaps a very happy situation. And Boris Pistorius essentially confirms the point made repeatedly by Brian Beletic in programme after programme that he's done on the new Atlas, that this is what Ukraine is getting in terms of tanks, armoured vehicles, at least specifically tanks, is likely all Ukraine is ever going to get. Western arsenals are now exhausted. For the West to send more tanks to Ukraine would put its own tank arsenals in severe jeopardy. Same is probably true in terms of infantry fighting vehicles. And we've seen that the West has basically given up any hope of trying to match the Russians in terms of ammunition production. So there we go. A situation which ultimately confirms again Brian Beletic's point. This offensive that Ukraine is talking about, the spring-summer offensive, when it's launched, presumably after the ground does finally harden, after the spring thaw, probably sometime in April, perhaps even May, when this offensive is launched, it will indeed be the last throw, because Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, has effectively said there is nothing else. The cupboard now is empty. There's nothing more that the Western powers can effectively give to Ukraine. Now, Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as I was saying yesterday, has cast doubt on whether Ukraine can in fact achieve a knockout blow over the Russians over the course of this spring-summer offensive, given how much it is now clear is riding on the outcome of this offensive. I would have thought that the obvious conclusion to draw from that is that this is a reckless and irresponsible gamble, and rather than press forward with it, putting so many more Ukrainian lives in jeopardy, the moment surely now is to negotiate with the Russians and to try to achieve some sort of peace. Well, I've discussed this so many times, I'm not going to repeat myself. Suffice to say, there is no suggestion or talk of that. On the contrary, as we hear, there are murmurings instead about sending some kind of intervention force into Ukraine from the EU, which, under the guise of peacekeepers. I'm going to come to that in a moment because the Russians have had more to say about that. Anyway, even as there's all this talk about the Ukrainian spring-summer offensive, the Russians continue their preparations, and there have been more and more sightings of more and more fortifications being created by the Russians in Zaporozhye region. And I noticed that the Institute for the Study of War has been talking about this. There's miles of fortifications of Dragon's Teeth, of minefields being created in southern Ukraine by the Russian army. And that work began in the autumn, and it seems to be continuing apace. It might even have accelerated over the recent days. And similar fortifications are being created in Kherson region and in Crimea. Now, I'm not saying that fortifications in and of themselves can defeat an offensive, but it's worth bearing in mind that when Ukraine launched its offensive in Kherson region in the autumn, last summer, and in the autumn, late August, and over the course of the autumn, it never achieved a breakthrough, even though Ukrainian forces outnumbered Russian forces west of the Dnieper and had many more tanks west of the Dnieper than the Russians did, who had supply problems as they had to rely on bridges, on operating from across bridges. And beyond that, the Russians never built the kind of elaborate fortifications that they are building now. So an offensive that failed, that, struggled in the autumn against much lighter Russian forces, not anchored in the kind of fortifications we are seeing now. This time it will be hurled against a much more powerful, much bigger Russian force, much more heavily equipped, and with huge fortifications, relying on huge fortifications as well. I'm not a military person. I'm not saying that perhaps some kind of offensive conducted in this sort of way can't succeed. But it seems to me we have dribbles of tanks from the West, token amounts of tanks from the West ultimately, perhaps 60 to 90 Leopard 2s, 14 Challenger 2s. All of the other tanks that the West is supplying up to now are Leopard 1s, which, I'm not discounting. They were no doubt very good tanks in their day, but they're not, it seems to me, a match for some of the Russian tanks they will be coming up against. And the Russians have far more tanks, more advanced tanks. They have these fortifications. They have hundreds of thousands of men, far more than they did at the time of the Ukrainian offensive in the autumn. And they outgun Ukraine massively. And of course, they have the benefit of an extremely powerful air force. Doesn't seem to me like the odds on this offensive are particularly favorable to Ukraine. Anyway, there we go. Now let's get back to that suggestion of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. And Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and deputy chair also of Russia's Military Industrial Commission, the man who has been put in charge of Russia's military-industrial complex for the purpose of waging this war. He's had a few things to say about this, and he's written all of this on his Telegram channel, and he says this: "It is obvious that such peacekeepers are our unvarnished enemies, wolves in sheep's clothing. They would be a legitimate target for our armed forces should they be deployed at the front lines without Russia's consent, with weapons in hand and presenting a direct threat to us. These peacekeepers must be destroyed mercilessly, as they are the soldiers of the enemy. They will die in the course of combat. Is Europe prepared for a long line of coffins holding its peacekeepers? There true intentions are crystal clear: to impose a peace that is favourable to them on the line of contact from a position of strength, and to station their peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, who would be armed with assault rifles and riding on tanks, and would be wearing some sort of blue helmets with yellow stars. And Medvedev is then quoted as going on to say, the potential results of such actions can be seen in the history of operations conducted by the United States and its allies in various regions of the world, including the tragedies of Korea, Vietnam, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous African countries. It is clear that the so-called NATO peacekeepers are simply preparing to enter the conflict on the side of our enemies in order to make hay out of this, bringing the situation to the point of no return and to unleash that World War III they claim to be afraid of. Well, what Medvedev is basically saying, no chance of Russia accepting Western peacekeepers in Ukraine. If they enter Ukraine, they will be treated by the Russians as enemies, and they will become combatants. And I have to say this straight away, I don't think that West European publics are prepared to take on the Russian army in this way, and I'm having growing doubts that publics in some East European states like Poland and Romania, for example, would be willing to be used in that way either. So very strong words from Dmitry Medvedev. Now, I mentioned that he's the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. Even as I am making this video, I saw a report that the Kremlin has announced that next week the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, will be convening in an enlarged session. And of course, we don't know the topics that are going to be discussed, the nature of the agenda that's going to be discussed, but we've had visits to the headquarters of the Russian forces in Ukraine, this headquarters being located in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, and we've had visits by Putin, we've had visits by Shoigu, all taking place over the course of the last few days. And I can't help but think that this enlarged meeting is going to be about the situation in Ukraine and about what the Russians are planning to do there, and that these comments from Medvedev are in some way connected to this forthcoming meeting, of which, of course, as the deputy chair of the Security Council, he will have been informed about in advance. Whilst on the topic of the Russian Security Council, I would also mention that another one of its top officials, Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Russian Security Council, has recently been on a trip to India, where he's had meetings with secretaries of Security Council's national security advisors from various other friendly states, but where I have no doubt at all that he has had meetings with senior officials of the Indian government. And it is to India again now that I propose to turn, because there's been quite a lot from India recently, and one of these things is that there's been some suggestions from the various sources that the United States and its allies are becoming deeply disappointed about the stance that India is taking, and that there are the first moves in the United States to try to change the political situation in India. Some people are even talking about some sort of a regime change operation in India by the United States. I have to say that I'm strongly skeptical that that is the case. I think that attempting a regime change operation in India would be a crazy idea for the United States and for the Western powers. But having said that, some of the decisions that have been coming out of Washington have been so bizarre that I can't discount it completely. Anyway, suffice to say that the West is now starting to snipe at India, and they're starting to cite human rights issues again as the grounds for doing so. And this is perhaps not so surprising, because I remember that about a year ago, in one of Tony Blinken's meetings with the Chinese officials, Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, came as close as anybody has ever done to explaining what the rules-based international order actually is. I've never seen a proper, full definition of this rules-based international order, but over the course of this meeting with the Chinese, Tony Blinken said that there is international law. Human rights law is part of the body of international law. It takes precedence over every other part of international law, which must accordingly be interpreted according to human rights law. And of course, the people who interpret human rights law are the self-proclaimed champions and defenders of human rights law, which is to say the United States government and its friends. That is a formula which, if it is a correct formula, if it is indeed what the United States actually believes, no other country in the world, in my opinion, will accept, and that might be the reason why the United States says so little about it in public. But anyway, that was something that I remember Blinken saying, and it does explain the way in which the West uses human rights abuses or alleged human rights abuses to defend its meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. And, well, we are now told that the European Union says that it is closely following the case in India against the Indian opposition leader, Rahul Gandhi, and his dismissal from Parliament. And Rahul Gandhi is the leader of the Indian Congress Party, the party of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Pandit Nehru and Indira Gandhi, the leaders of India's independence movement and the Indian Prime Minister who won the 1971 war against Pakistan. And of course, the party that dominated Indian politics for most of the decades after India achieved independence, and which is still a powerful force politically in India itself. Now, I have not in any way familiarized myself with Rahul Gandhi's case. I'm not going to comment on it. What I will simply say is this: the Indians will see Western commentary, Western statements about them following the case involving Rahul Gandhi as interference in their internal affairs. And the Modi government, which looks pretty secure to me at this present time, pretty well established as the Indian government, is not going to take kindly to this interference as it will see it in India's internal affairs. And M.K. Bhadrakumar, the Indian diplomat who writes the blog, the absolutely outstanding blog, Indian Punchline, has tweeted anyway about this, about the EU closely following the case against Rahul Gandhi as follows. Such a thing never happened during the 1975 emergency. The 1975 emergency was a state of emergency declared by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in the mid-1970s. She was facing severe political challenges. At that time, she declared a state of emergency, assumed sweeping powers. Many people thought that she was on the brink of declaring herself a dictator and that she was leading India away from democracy. And there was lots of arrests and a major crackdown across India at that time. Though in the event, I should say that Indira Gandhi did indeed in the end call an election. She lost the election. Her long-standing opponent, Morarji Desai, the leader of the Janata Party at that era, won the election and became Prime Minister. He ran what was a rather unsuccessful government, and Indira Gandhi was then re-elected and came back to office some years later. So the expectations or fears that many had at the time that the 1975 emergency would result in India becoming a dictatorship were not fulfilled. Anyway, the point Bhadrakumar is making is that such a thing, that is to say, Western observation of particular cases in India, never happened during the 1975 emergency, which is a far more draconian step, far more wide-ranging, far more sweeping than, of course, the case against Rahul Gandhi. And he goes on to say, for Western governments then, it was business as usual. Why now? The European Commission is lately performing as the mouthpiece of the Biden administration, e.g. von der Leyen's unprecedented attack on China just before her visit to Beijing, accompanying Emmanuel Macron. And it's worth saying that Bhadrakumar, though he seeks to remain reasonably neutral in talking about Indian politics, he's never particularly impressed me as a strong supporter of Prime Minister Modi. My sense is that, if anything, he probably leans more to Congress than to Modi and Modi's party, though I don't speak for him and I might be wrong about that. But certainly he's not an uncritical supporter of Prime Minister Modi, but we see that even he takes it very ill when the Western powers start to lecture India on its domestic policies. And I have to say, I think that the Indian government will take this extremely askance indeed. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of Bhadrakumar, as I said, he does write a really quite exceptional blog, and I noticed that in his latest piece, he's made a number of points about China and about the stance that China is taking in international affairs. And I'm going to read this piece at some length. And it starts as follows. The Russian media reported that President Putin made an extraordinary gesture as President Xi Jinping left the Kremlin following the state dinner last week on Tuesday evening. by escorting Xi Jinping to the limousine and seeing him off. And Xi, during the goodbye handshake, reportedly responded, "Together we should push forward these changes that have not happened for 100 years. Take care." And Badrakuma goes on to say, Xi was alluding to the past 100 years of modern history that witnessed the United States transforming itself from a country to the north of Mexico in the Western Hemisphere to a superpower and global hegemon. With his profound sense of history and dialectical mind, Xi was recording the intense talks with Putin that dwelt on the contemporary realities, burying the US's unipolar moment in the dustbin and on the imperatives of China and Russia joining hands to consolidate the transition of the world order towards democratization and multipolarity. It was an appropriate finale to a state visit that began the previous evening with Xi expressing confidence that Russians will support Putin at the presidential elections next year. At one stroke, Xi cancelled the West's demonizing of Putin, mindful of the absurdity of even arranging an arrest warrant against the Kremlin leader to detract from his talks in Moscow. China has a scrupulous policy of refraining from commenting on the internal affairs of other countries. However, in the case of the situation surrounding Russia, Xi has made a notable exception by signalling his keenness for Putin's proactive leadership in such tumultuous times. The majority of world opinion, especially in the global south, will agree. And by the way, Badrakuma is absolutely right. Xi Jinping telling Putin that he supports Putin's re-election next year is a momentous step. It is a momentous endorsement of Putin personally by China. It confirms, all but confirms, that Putin does indeed intend to stand again as president of Russia next year. And it is indeed a departure from China's policy of strict non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. And far from being unpopular in Russia, it has been welcomed. And by the way, I saw the latest opinion poll in Russia from Sion, which is admittedly a state-backed Russian polling agency, and it puts Putin's favorability rating at over 80%. It is, in fact, again, rising. And why is all this happening? Why are the Chinese showing so much favor to the Russians at the moment? And Badrakuma, I think, has had, again, put his finger on the key point. There has been a dramatic change of mood in Beijing. The nadir was reached with the boorish behavior by President Biden in his State of the Union address on February 7th, when he went off script and hysterically shouted, "Name me a world leader who changed places with Xi Jinping." In Eastern culture, such boorishness is taken as unforgivably scandalous behavior in the weeks since the United States shot down a Chinese weather balloon and maligned China internationally. Beijing has responded by rebuffing several attempts by the White House seeking a telephone conversation between Biden and President Xi. Beijing has had enough of Biden's hollow promises to mend ties whilst on the sly strengthening alliances across the Asia-Pacific region, inserting NATO into the Asia-Pacific power dynamic and sending additional forces and firepower to places like Guam and the Philippines, apart from single-mindedly striving to weaken China's economy. Xi's Moscow visit became a great occasion for Russia and China to reaffirm their no-limit partnership and scatter the Western attempts since the war broke out in Ukraine to create a rift in the Sino-Russian relationship. And I think on all of these points, Badr Kuma is absolutely right. Over the last few weeks, the Chinese have had enough. They've come to the clear view that the attempt to establish an effective working relationship with the Biden administration, even if it is an adversarial relationship, has collapsed. Biden lies to them, as Badr Kuma says. He pretends, on the one hand, he makes hollow promises to mend ties, whilst on the sly strengthening alliances across the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, quietly supporting Taiwan's moves towards independence. And in that disastrous State of the Union address, the mask finally fell. Biden went off script and personally and angrily insulted Xi Jinping in a way that must have made completely clear to the Chinese what he actually thinks about them and about their leader. And then Badr Kuma notices something which I've already talked about in a previous program, and that is this article by Hu Cixin, the former editor-in-chief of Global Times, in which Hu Cixin made the point that the Western powers, over the course of the Ukraine conflict, have exposed the hollowness of their military pretensions. They claim to be the mightiest military alliance on earth, and in some respects, they are. But Russia, a country with supposedly a much smaller economy than the United States, let alone the combined collective West, has nevertheless managed to outpace them in arms production for the war that has been fought in Ukraine itself. We go back to what Boris Pistorius said: Germany can't send any more tanks. It's run out of tanks. It doesn't have any more to spare. Neither does Britain. The United States is having to go back and dust out old tanks from its old arsenal, and the Europeans are having to cobble together numbers by bringing also even older Leopard 1 tanks out of store. And they have nothing else beyond that to send. And Badr Kuma actually quotes what Hu Cixin actually said. The US, and this is Hu Cixin's words, but Badr Kuma says these are some stunning conclusions that Hu Cixin, who, as I say, is very close to the Chinese leadership, has reached. The US and the West have found it much more difficult than expected to defeat Russia. They know that China has not provided military aid to Russia, and the question that haunts them is, if Russia alone is already so difficult to deal with, what if China really starts to provide military aid to Russia using its massive industrial capabilities for the Chinese military? Would the situation on the Ukrainian battlefield fundamentally change? Furthermore, Russia alone can already confront the entire West in Ukraine if they really force China and Russia to join hands, what changes will there be in the world's military situation? And the Badrakuma adds the further point: isn't the notion prevalent in the United States and Europe that the Russia-China alliance is an alliance of unequals, itself a self-serving Western fallacy? Who is spot on? Although China's comprehensive strength is still short of that of the United States, in combination with Russia, there is a paradigm shift in the balance, and the United States is no longer entitled to act as it pleases. So the United States and the Western powers are finding that they can't defeat Russia, outproduce Russia, in what it must be said is a land war. It would add all other areas of military power. The Western powers are undoubtedly more powerful than Russia in terms of air forces, much more powerful than Russia in terms of air forces, though Russia does have an exceptionally powerful air defense system, and that might, for all I know, be a match for Western air power. And of course, the Western powers also have vastly bigger naval strength, though again, Russia's submarine force and its growing arsenal of hypersonic missiles cannot be discounted in assessing such a balance, and I'm not the kind of person to assess a balance in that way. It's not really for me to say. But anyway, in a land war, clearly, for the moment, the Western powers are being outmatched by the Russians. And note that the military balance is shifting in Russia's favor. We hear that Russian weapons production is accelerating. Shoigu has said it, Lukashenko has said it, Putin has said it, all the facts point to it. Russian military production is intensifying. Russia is producing more tanks, more shells, more guns, more infantry fighting vehicles. They're also building up new divisions. This is what was announced at that meeting in the Defense Ministry Board in December, which Putin attended. Whereas the West, as Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, has just admitted, the Germans can't get their act together before 2030 at the earliest. The British will probably take even longer. And I was reading articles yesterday in the United States about the difficulties the United States has in increasing weapons production from the levels that it has at the moment, the insufficient levels that it has at the moment. And we saw that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, yesterday was admitting that the United States only has a small number of ATACMS missiles and can't therefore afford to supply any to Ukraine without endangering its own limited stockpile. So, a shifting military balance in Europe, Russia getting stronger, the West getting weaker, the exact opposite, by the way, of what you often read in the Western media, but that is the actual military reality. And this on the basis of a Russian military-industrial complex, which is proportionately only a fraction of the size, potential size, of the Chinese. As Badrakuma rightly says, if you put these two countries, Russia and China, together, you create a force, a geopolitical, military, diplomatic, economic force that in aggregate surpasses the resources of the West. And that is something the West has never experienced before in its modern history. The United States has never experienced before, arguably at any time in its history, at least since the war it fought with the British Empire in 1812. And it's not something that Western powers have really assimilated or understood. And we see, and this is the other point that Badr Kumar is making, that the actions of the Biden administration and of President Biden himself are making it worse. Well, as Badr Kumar rightly says, Ursula von der Leyen is heading for Beijing to meet Xi Jinping, and she's doing it in the company of Emmanuel Macron. And we'll see what happens when she goes there. She gave a speech about EU relations with China, which, though I think it was intended to be conciliatory, I think actually are going to raise Chinese hackles. It again seemed to position the EU in some kind of stance of superiority over China, which I personally don't think the Chinese are going to take kindly to at all. And if the Europeans think they can lecture the Chinese about relations with Russia and about relations with Ukraine, well, I think they're going to find that the Chinese are not going to be prepared to be lectured at all. And I say that in light of a Chinese readout that we now have of Xi Jinping's meeting with Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain. Now, I'm not going to read the whole readout. Like all Chinese readouts, it is extremely long. But two things immediately stood out to me, and that is that the Chinese readout contains no mention of Russia whatsoever. Sanchez apparently went to Beijing in part because European leaders are becoming worried about the growing proximity of China and Russia to each other. The Chinese have made it absolutely clear that, as far as they're concerned, their relationship with Moscow is not a fit topic for discussion with third parties. And the Chinese readout, as I said, doesn't even refer to Russia. I'm not saying that the topic of Russia was not brought up by the Spanish, but if it was, the Chinese, Xi Jinping, will have given the Spanish a brush off. They'll have told them, well, look, we're not interested in discussing this topic at all. And then there's a very brief reference to Ukraine. It's the only part of the readout I'm going to read. It says the following. This is the Chinese readout of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Sanchez. The two sides exchanged views on the Ukrainian crisis. Xi Jinping stressed that China's position is consistent and clear, which is promoting peace talks and a political settlement. The Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation should be abandoned, and so should extreme sanctions and pressure. He expressed the hope that relevant parties will build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture through dialogue and consultation. And then the readout goes on to quote Sanchez as briefing Xi Jinping on Spanish views and saying that Spain speaks positively of the Chinese position paper on Ukraine and appreciates China's constructive role in the political settlement of Ukraine. Now, note a few things. We got reports of the Western media that Sanchez pressed Xi Jinping to call Zelensky to balance his visit to Moscow, Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow of last week, with a call to Zelensky. Well, maybe Sanchez did say that, but there's no hint of that in this readout. If Sanchez did say it, the Chinese have ignored it, and there's no hint in this readout that Xi Jinping, for the moment, has any intention of calling Zelensky. Perhaps he will in due course, but he's certainly not going to do it because the Spanish or the Europeans are asking him to. And notice what the Chinese readout says that Xi Jinping said. He said that China wants peace talks and a political settlement. At the moment, of course, it is Ukraine that is rejecting talks, and its stance is being backed by the West, which is also rejecting a ceasefire. And Xi Jinping also said that the West, and it really is the West, should abandon its Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation approach. Bloc confrontation can only mean NATO, because that is the only bloc involved in the crisis in Ukraine, and that extreme sanctions and pressure, which is what the West has been exerting on Russia, should be abandoned. And Xi Jinping also said that he hopes that the relevant parties, carefully not to say which parties, but he clearly includes the Europeans as well, Xi Jinping hopes that they will build a balanced, effective and sustainable European security architecture through dialogue and consultation. In other words, a clear hint, perhaps more than a hint in the actual discussion, that the Europeans and the Western powers need to start taking Russian security concerns seriously, concerns that include but are not limited to the eastward expansion of NATO, and should revisit the topic, perhaps, of those two draft treaties that the Russians proposed in December 2021. So, all of this couched by the Chinese in their typically moderate, measured, courteous terms, but unambiguously clear nonetheless. Relations between China and Russia are not up for discussion, and it's the West that needs to change its approach to the Ukraine crisis in order to bring it to an end. And the readout is very careful to say that Xi Jinping, in his meeting with Sanchez, was accompanied by the two most senior diplomats in the Chinese system, Wang Yi, the former foreign minister, now in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy, and Xing Gang, the new foreign minister. Well, that's me for the day. As you can see, a lot going on the diplomatic front, perhaps less information from the military position. I suspect a lot more is going on in Bakhmut than reports are suggesting, and we'll probably get some news about Bakhmut in the next few days. I'm now increasingly coming round to the view that it's unlikely that we're going to see a Ukrainian counterattack to try to break the siege of Bakhmut. I suspect that Ukrainian forces in and around Bakhmut, at the moment at least, are fulfilling purely defensive roles. the Russians still appear to have the initiative. Maybe the Ukrainians will counterattack at some point, but for the moment they're not doing so. Anyway, more about that soon. And for the rest, we could see how the international position continues to shift, and shift in ways that are not favourable to the United States and to the West. Well, thank you again for joining me. Just to remind you, all programmes, all Duran and Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou programmes can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.